Our next presentation will be on the subject of sociology, the American identity issue, and its contribution and relationship to polarization. We will resume the idea that individual questions will be asked by the pro and con legal team after the presentation from the science team. So the initial presentation from the science team will be by Mr. David Ashley.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Ashley. I'm here to give us a presentation on, well, as mentioned before, American identity and its relationship to polarization. So, in order to define what national identity is, we need to first clarify what we mean by national attachment. And so national attachment can be defined in multiple different ways, but generally it refers to, the attachment one has to the nation. And obviously, so we can measure this in multiple different ways. We'll just focus on one. So here we have national identity, which I'll go into more detail later, symbolic patriotism, constructive patriotism, and uncritical patriotism. These are typically measured using self-reported surveys. I'll just focus on national identity for now, but feel free to ask if we can look into the other definitions, since I mostly cut those for time. All right, so national identity. So this refers to the concept of identifying with a certain nation. So it answers questions such as, how important is being American to you? To what extent do you see yourself as a typical American? And how well does the term American describe you? This is a preferred method of measuring national attachment, since it should be less ideologically divisive than the other measures of national attachment. All right, shifting tacks now. What do we mean by effective polarization? This specifically refers to the animosity between two different groups. We'll typically discuss this in terms of political polarization. And although this can be applied to multiple different frameworks rather than just politics. For example, we can also apply this to racial polarization and social polarization, in referring to racial tensions and social classes, respectively. And we also typically measure these using self-reported surveys. We call this effective polarization because these measures are emotionally based. So something to keep in mind is that these frameworks can't always be so cleanly separated. We need to consider something to consider is the relationship between national and ethnic identities. Oops. National policies can affect certain populations of people. So, for example, we can look at the fact that Arab Muslims in Israel are not included in military conscription, or, as mentioned before, discriminatory housing policies against African American populations. Groups that were the target of systemic oppression, such as ethnic minorities, tend to have an inverse correlation between national identity, ethnic identity, and national identity. So what I mean by that is generally that, ethnic minorities in this context, will have a much higher ethnic identity compared to their national identity. Yeah. So how are these concepts related, specifically American identity and effective polarization? So we can encourage a reduction in effective polarization by heightening a sense of national identity, as given by. This causes people to view partisans of the opposing party, in this case Democrats or Republicans, more positively. Cements the idea that we have a common American identity as Americans rather than as opposing partisans. This is shown to be effective during national holidays, like the 4th of July, for example. But as mentioned before, this will be less effective on ethnic minority populations due to their lowered amounts of national identity. All right, recap, just so we're all clear here. We measured national attachment by a way of metric of national identity. We prefer this due to its nonpartisan nature. Minority populations tend to identify more with their ethnic group than with their nation. Effective polarization refers to the animosity between two groups of people, as in Democrats and Republicans. And effective polarization can be reduced by encouraging sentiments of national identity. And here are my citations.
Thank you very much. At this time, we'll now have specific questions from the pro and con legal teams. Mr. Arun Sunthrilingam will ask questions on behalf of the pro team for the purpose of clarifying these issues. Go ahead, Mr. Sunthrilingam.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, David, for your presentation. I have two questions for you today. In your presentation, you referred about Arab Muslims being excluded from the Israeli military. Could you tell us more about the impact of that decision towards its relationship with other ethnicities?
All right, so the study where I got that figure from specifically mentions the relationship between, the Israeli majority population between two different minority groups, specifically the Arab Muslims and the Druze. So, essentially, the Druze were included in the conscription program, meaning that as opposed to the Arab Muslims who were excluded. This meant that, I believe the paper referred to the Druze having a greater positive piece as opposed to the Arab Muslims who had a more of a negative piece, as I recall.
Thank you. My second question, in your presentation, you mentioned about heightening the sense of a national identity. Could you expand on what that means?
Right, expanding this. This generally refers to the idea of bringing it to the forefront of people's minds. So making everyone aware of their national identity. I believe this might be elaborated on in later presentations, but that's what I'm going to go with right now.
Thank you, David. No more questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Ms. Madeline Stinkowitz will ask questions on behalf of the con legal team.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you so much, David. David, could you please tell us what the line between a strong American identity and nationalism is?
All right, so it's important to consider that there is a rather important distinction between these concepts. American identity is simply the concept of belonging to the social group of Americans. Nationalism is specifically the belief that America is the greatest country in the world and other countries should follow its example.
Perfect. And then could you please explain how how we can prevent American identity from turning into an attitude of American supremacy?
All right, so these concepts, as mentioned before, are somewhat distinct. So in order to prevent this sort of issue where we turn this into nationalism, we should be able to prevent this by emphasizing a common American identity for us to root ourselves in, rather than focusing on things like national pride. So, we'll be brought together rather than trying to emphasize our own accomplishments.
Perfect. And then one last question. Would you be able to define constructive patriotism for us?
Absolutely. Let me quickly share the screen since I have up right now. All right, so constructive patriotism is specifically defined by wanting to improve a nation due to your attachment to it. So if I criticize the United States, I do so out of love for the country. Or if I oppose some U.S. policies because I care about my country and want to improve it.
Perfect. No more questions, Your Honor.
We have some questions from the jury. Question probably is actually directed to both the pro and con legal teams. So if the representatives of pro and con legal teams would be on screen, the question really is, how do these programs balance the idea of national identity without getting into the risk of extremism or nationalism that is excessive in, and I believe that was a question that Ms. Stankiewicz was also asking. So how do these programs separate a healthy national identity from something that gets into extremism? Mr. Centhrillingham.
Thank you, Your Honor. That's a great question. And I think a key distinction needs to be made in our mandatory service program. While establishing a common American identity is part of it, it is not the main point of the program. When participants are put into the program that they were selected to be in, they will be carrying out a goal-oriented task, which will require cooperation between individuals that they don't normally interact with in a heterogeneous group. So extents of American identity would be based on interpersonal communication or intercultural communication within the group, and establishing and recognizing that people can come from different places and different backgrounds and still have the same wish in order to improve the country. So our program won't stress the idea of establishing a specific version of American identity, but allow it to come organically from interactions.
Ms. Stankiewicz.
Yes, I completely agree with the pro-team's previous statement. We also do not want to create a group of people who identify as being American and refuse to criticize America. In fact, I believe that David put it best when he said, "I criticize my country because I love it." And therefore, we are attempting to create a sense of community within America rather than the fierce sense of Americanism.
Thank you. Mr. Centhrillingham, a question from the jury that is directed to polarization within the service programs. I believe it's sort of a variation of the issue we already addressed. How are you going to avoid creating a specific polarization occurring within service programs?
So we do recognize that having people from different backgrounds come together can posit its issues. But that is why within our program, as you will hear later in Manix's presentation, the main goal of the program will be to do the tasks designated by the organization the participant is in. So people, and when they are in the group, they will be required to cooperate with one another. And thus we believe that communications about common national identities or communications about learning about people who have different backgrounds from you will arise from those interactions, as opposed to us teaching you that. But in the event that polarizing issues do come up, there will be the presence of the institutional facilitator, that they will be there in order to settle issues before they become too negative and damaging towards group morale.
Thank you very much. Now, a statement from the pro-legal team, Mr. Centhrillingham, a statement with respect to this issue.
So we heard a lot of revealing things from David's presentation. I asked him about what is the consequence of the Israeli military's decision to exclude a specific ethnic minority from their military service. And the reason I asked this is because this is one thing that we on the mandatory side will wish to solve. By having everybody of a certain age group be required to perform mandatory service, specifically targeted at those who are 18 and above, we think that you will have everybody from different backgrounds be part of it. So nobody would be excluded. That is something that the people on the voluntary side will have difficulty trying to establish. But now let's pivot to the idea of an American identity. What is an American identity? does a Minnesotan version of an American identity necessarily relate to what a Texan would consider American identity? I don't think so, but I don't think it is our job to decide which is much more American than the other. In fact, they all, from people from all 50 states, constitute what makes up the tapestry of America. They are all Americans. And we think that the problem is that people do not have exposure to people in a lengthy amount of time in order to truly understand and relate to people who are not from the same area as them. All of us have been to high school. How many times have we latched on to the first group of friends we meet and make throughout the entire duration of high school? It is within its normal human nature in order to stick to what you know, stick to your community. But in our part of the program, we wish to put people in different environments. And this is absolutely vital in order to establish a tapestry of American identity. That American identity, that a person from Minnesota and a person from California and a person from Florida to a person to Texas, all may have different political views, which we are not trying to quash. We think that we don't want to establish a uniform version of America, but we want to establish a version where people can respect the possibility that somebody can come from a different background, but at the same time wish to better the country in a constructive way. That is the version of the American identity we wish to adopt. And as I said, this would come organically from interactions between participants as they are carrying out their tasks. Because our duration is 6 months, we believe a lot of cultural and interpersonal communications would occur. And therefore, we believe that this is how we can try to solve and try to reduce polarization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dinkowitz, a statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. As I previously mentioned, I believe that the purpose of this trial can be wrapped up perfectly in Mr. Ashley's statement. If I criticize the United States, I do so out of the love for my country. Now, that, of course, is what we are trying to build. Neither team is attempting to erase dissent. In fact, the United States has been built upon dissent. However, our side believes in building community and commonality. We believe that in order to encourage people to come together and have these difficult discussions about politics and race, they must do so with people that already have some sense of commonality. Now, of course, I grew up in Minnesota. I wear the Minnesota state on my neck 24/7. And I am more comfortable with people who are from the North, mostly because that's just how I was raised. However, finding those commonalities with people from my community who also have differing opinions, I believe really breaks down what we need to find in this type of situation. Thank you.
Thank you.